Stanford University.
I don't know if this is working or not, but good afternoon. Hello, and welcome back to class and to your reunion. It's not working. Fine, then I'll just, I'll project, as we used to say in the theater. Welcome back to the farm, and I hope you're enjoying a wonderful reunion weekend. I am Wolf Kurtzman. I work for Stanford's Office of Development. I'm responsible for the states from New Mexico to Georgia, so if you happen to live in one of those states, introduce yourself to me, please. I'm also a proud alumnus of the Stanford Law School and celebrated my 40th reunion last year. So if you're here with a law school celebrating reunion, welcome back. We're delighted that you're here. Please take the time to turn off your cell phones or other noise-making devices during the class. And it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker today. Mariano-Florentino Cuellar, Professor of Law and Dean F. Johnson Faculty Scholar, has been at Stanford since 2001. He runs the Center for International Security and Cooperation and has led policy on issues ranging from food safety to crime prevention, as he is an expert on federal regulatory policy, public safety, and international security. Tino was recently appointed by President Barack Obama to the Council of the Administrative Conference of the United States, an independent agency charged with improving the efficiency and fairness of federal agencies. Please join me in welcoming Tino Cuellar.
Thank you very much and good afternoon. I'm absolutely delighted to have the chance to spend some of the afternoon with you talking about a subject that I find very interesting, and you do too, otherwise you probably wouldn't be here. I should tell you that I'm glad that it was clarified to me that this was classes without quizzes and not quizzes without classes, because at first I thought this would be a lot easier for me. I just had to write a quiz and you could take it, but we won't proceed that way. How many of you remember the first time you voted? The first time you voted, and probably the first time you voted in a presidential election. I remember like it was yesterday. I got a paper cut. I remember feeling the ballot in my hands and feeling a sense of magic, a sense that I was connected to something much vaster than myself. And really, I think it was the first time that I began to feel like democracy actually meant something that I could touch. I could touch the ballot, I could feel the paper cut, and it struck me right then and there that sometime in the future I hoped that I would have a chance to understand a little bit more something that is a little bit almost alchemical, the sense of how we elect somebody who is sitting in the Oval Office, who makes choices on behalf of all of us, who has the burden of representing hundreds of millions of people. What I want to do over the next half hour or so before I open it up to questions is something very simple. I want to back into talking to you about what the executive branch of the United States looks like in the 21st century. But I want to get there by a circuitous route, because as I thought about having this conversation with you today, it struck me that I couldn't really have the conversation I wanted to about the executive in the 21st century if I didn't start in the 20th century. In fact, if I didn't start even earlier. If I didn't spend some time explaining a little bit, how does the presidency work? What have we learned about the history of the presidency over the last 100, 150 years or longer? And that in turn takes a little bit of discussion about the context in which a president operates. So what I'm going to do is to give you a little bit of that context. Then I'm going to tell you three stories, essentially, about presidential administrations. And I emphasize that what I will share with you will involve probably going over some facts that you've heard about, that you've known, that you've reflected on, that you've maybe lived through, but also maybe giving a slightly different angle, maybe suggesting that there are aspects of the presidency and of the executive branch that are sometimes not so obvious unless you start thinking about it more carefully. And in the end, I'll try to bring it back and suggest some very tentative observations about what is happening with the executive branch in the 21st century. And as I think you'll see, one of the takeaways is that the 21st century is very, very different, but it's not. So with that, I'm going to acknowledge that thinking about the executive branch makes you potentially laugh or cry, and that's why I'm going to start this discussion by showing you a picture of a baby. This is a picture of a baby born in the 1800s. That baby was born into a world with no International Monetary Fund, no World Bank, no Environmental Protection Agency, no Cold War, no nuclear weapons. But that baby was born into an economy, an American economy, that would have given the IMF or the World Bank pause if they existed. It was an economy of much macroeconomic instability, and the country faced an uncertain future. The country faced geostrategic threats, it faced internal concerns about its future, it faced the challenge of territorial expansion, it faced immigration issues that raised questions about where was the country going and who was the country. This is a baby born in 2009. So the difference suggests to you, for one, obviously that America is always changing demographically, but it also underscores how much has changed in the world that the baby is being born into. The baby is being born into a world of extraordinary scientific progress relative to the 1800s, of much longer life expectancies, of access to personal technologies that we carry in our pockets that would have had to take up this entire room maybe just 30 or 40 years ago. But one thing that I'll come to that is very important to our conversation about the presidency is that in one respect, the world and the country that this baby is being born into is exactly the same as the world that the 1800s baby was being born into, and that's that the US Constitution still applies. And I'll say more about that in a second, but I do want to underscore this point about just how much has changed in the world. So the life expectancy of that baby was about 39 years. The life expectancy of this baby is about 82 years. Science, technology, international politics, domestic politics, continually changing. I want to show you a different picture that helps tell that story. You can't see all the details here, but you can see that if you look at the yellow, it stays flat for a while. So those are about the first 35 years of the 1800s, and then you see that balloon going up, almost inexorably forward. And what you have here is a graph of the United States relative to other countries when we plot income per person, GDP per capita, basically how wealthy is each individual on average in the country, and what is the life expectancy. So for the first 40 or so years of the 1800s, what you see is wealth rising, but life expectancy staying essentially the same. And then eventually you begin to see dramatic increases in health and wealth. This is just one way of showing you data that tells the story of how America is a pretty unique country. It's not the only country that has made this dramatic increase, but it is absolutely the only country of its size, the only country of its population that has managed to get the level of wealth and health that it has. And I would argue that if you combine that discussion of the country's health and wealth with the national defense expenditures we have, tell a story about the role of this country in the world, and with the history of our country, which for a variety of reasons gives us, at least in theory, a claim to shaping the discourse around the world about what democracy means, what the rule of law means, then you start to get a sense of the extraordinary global influence that this country has. And that global influence, that degree of power, underscores the special role of the American executive. Now, this is a picture of John F. Kennedy sitting in the Oval Office with one of his advisors, pondering what to do about the Cuban Missile Crisis. Think for a moment about how that picture conveys a great deal. It's a small reminder of something I'll come back to in a second, which is the extent to which the presidency is not a single individual. It's an interlocking set of organizations, of advisors, of agencies, of informal friends even that the president has that might give perspectives. But in the end, in that office and in that chair is concentrated extraordinary authority. And in some respects, I would argue that the fundamental challenge that our executive branch poses is not so different from the challenge posed to any functioning state around the world. And that is, how can you get a government that is efficient, that is fast, that is able to live up to the demands of its public, but also avoids arbitrary power, unconstrained exercises of power. And when you think about the person sitting in the Oval Office, by custom and to some degree by law, that person can send troops abroad, can affect the lives of hundreds of thousands of young Americans, can change the discussion about policy priorities for millions of Americans, and shape what happens in small villages around the world. But we also ask ourselves, how do we live in a world where that person is not entirely unconstrained? How do we limit the authority that that individual has? Surely part of the answer is the US Constitution. what unites to some degree that baby born in the 1800s and that baby born in 2009. This text from Article 2 of the Constitution is probably not unfamiliar to you. You've probably heard this in some form. The executive power, the notion of that power being vested in an office, the President of the United States. These are important words. There are hundreds of cases over the course of our history that try to make sense to some degree of how those words end up affecting the day-to-day operations of the government. But it's fair to say, and I feel like I'm able to say this at least to some degree because I have to teach this material, that those words don't tell us that much, and in some respects you can imagine yourself looking a little like that if you try to understand exactly what it means. One good thing from my perspective, since I teach administrative law in this classroom, is that the ambiguities in the Constitution translate into full employment for administrative lawyers, for those of us who ask ourselves, how does the Constitution work day to day? Does Section 2 help us? Well, we get a little additional detail, but in some respects we don't get that much. Just read the words and let them hang on in your mind for a second. The words commander-in-chief are up there. You've seen those before. The idea that, think about this as massive power, right? The Constitution mentions it specifically. The president is empowered to request the opinions in writing of subordinate officials. Gives you a sense of how the framers were struggling with this question of how much power do we give the president? How do we specify that power but not go too far? And again, you could imagine that day to day that creates some confusion, applying that, figuring out what it means. Section 3 says a little bit more, talks about the State of the Union idea, talks about appointments, but in the end, we can spend more time on this in discussion if you'd like. I would argue the constitutional framework is supremely important, and yet it leaves to us the task of applying it day in, day out. And it gives us a structure that in some respects is ambiguous, that does not entirely settle the question of exactly what role the president is going to be playing day to day as he deals or she deals someday with Congress. And I would argue that those open-ended pieces of the structure, combined with special challenges the president faces, gives us a sense of certain patterns that recur that will shed light on how the presidency operates in the 21st century. I'm now going to briefly review some of those challenges, in addition to figuring out how to apply the structure of the Constitution, and then I'll briefly tell you three stories, one from the Roosevelt Administration, one from the LBJ Administration, and one from the George W. Bush Administration. So I don't have to belabor that one challenge the president has faced, at least since Franklin Roosevelt, is the reality that Americans expect the president to be an important voice in the stewardship of the American economy. And this is not an easy time to play that role. It's not an easy time because you can see that our debt as a percentage of GDP is almost at the level it was at the highest point of the 20th century when we were fighting World War II. You can, yeah.
I can't read where that P is.
World War II. Yeah, so take my word for it. And I apologize, it's not even clear. So U.S. unemployment, I'll tell you again, is 9.8%, which is the highest it's been in several generations. And notwithstanding substantial discussion about the future of healthcare in this country, you still see that as a share of GDP, healthcare expenditures are rising fast. And a very dramatic chart that I don't have time to put up here and discuss much, but I'll just mention in passing, gives you a sense of how those changes in healthcare expenditures translate into really big increases into where each federal dollar is going and to how much of it goes to Medicare and Medicaid. This is a story of education, and it basically raises questions about what we mean when we say we want America to have a world-class education system. Because it basically tells you that if you look at what our kids know with respect to math and science on a variety of tests that are administered by an effort to try to compare educational achievement across countries, you see that we come out basically 25 out of 30 countries on mathematics and 24 out of 30 countries on science. Now, it is no easy thing to answer the question of how a president should deal with this. And I'm not here suggesting that the federal government has the only or even the primary responsibility for dealing with this. But you can imagine that when a thoughtful president walks into the Oval Office, he or she probably cannot ignore this. And I can talk about the country's expectations with respect to our security, about how much we ought to be concerned about nuclear proliferation, despite the fact that nuclear issues really are not on the front page so often, or about how the extent to which America expects to play a role in the global system might be driven by rising hunger, notwithstanding targets that had been set by the World Food Program and the Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN to lower hunger dramatically by now. But instead, as you can see, it's increasing. All this happens in an environment where a president has to worry about organizational challenges. This is the Eisenhower Executive Office building. It's where most of the White House staff works. About 1,000 people work in that building. And they're only the barest fraction of an incredibly vast federal government. Figuring out what the relationship should be day to day between the White House and that federal government is a huge challenge. It's a challenge to determine exactly how much the White House coordinates legislative proposals from those agencies, how much the president ought to keep his hands off decisions that happen at the agency level, but also at the same time, how much the president is accountable for what happens in the agencies. Let me show you another picture that's interesting. What I have here on your left is a number of government employees in the United States, going back to about the 1940s. And what's interesting here is that if you look closely, you'll find that the red line at the bottom, which is civilian employment in the US government, has actually stayed relatively flat. And what's more, if you look at citizens per government employee, and look at the federal government, you see that actually the number of citizens per employee has been rising. That means that for all the discussion of how vast the federal government is, two things are actually true. One is, yes, it is absolutely vast, huge. But it's actually getting smaller relative to the population. And that's a two-edged challenge for a president, because on the one hand, it means you have a vast federal government to try to understand and manage. But it also means that in some respects, you have to do more with less. And maybe that's a good thing. The first time I ever walked into the Roosevelt Presidential Library outside of Poughkeepsie, New York, I was there doing research for an article that's now turning into a book. And after about 3 hours, I came across a note. And this is the first time I'd actually seen a note that had Roosevelt's handwriting on it. And I just can't tell you what an effect that had. It just made me feel like I was transported into the past. And almost for a moment, just for a moment, I could just hear, ever so briefly, his thoughts. And I want to just set up the discussion, brief discussion of the Roosevelt administration by underscoring the challenges that he faced when he walked into the Oval Office. And walking was difficult for him, as you know. But he walked into an Oval Office where he faced an utter crisis of depression, of economic inactivity, and of people having lost faith not only in banks and not only in their government, but really in each other to some degree. He also faced a considerable degree of domestic resistance as he strategized with his advisors about what to do, how to deal with that problem. He faced a country that had become skeptical of the federal government in echoes of the 21st century, a government that did not necessarily know how to use the authority that Congress had given it, a Congress that was not entirely certain how much faith to put in the president. But soon after taking office, not only did Roosevelt have to confront that challenge, he also had to confront the challenge of a world that increasingly made demands on America with respect to security, and a public that was very skeptical about a vigorous American role in the world, particularly given that the economic challenges were long unresolved. And the third crisis that Roosevelt faced, just as all these other dramas were playing out, was a question of how the government could work together, and in particular, how the Supreme Court of the United States and the courts would relate to the executive branch. So the familiar ultimate decision of Roosevelt to challenge the Supreme Court by trying to enlarge it is only, as you will see, one piece of the puzzle of how this tension played out. Here's Franklin Roosevelt preparing for what came to be known as a fireside chat. Now I want to just underscore for a moment how this picture tells you how much the presidency evolves in relation to technology. How much when Roosevelt came into office, he was confronting a new challenge to some degree, which was how should this new technology, this radio that can beam my words into millions of American families' homes, change my relationship with the public? Now note, it was not a common thing at that point for presidents to give press conferences, for presidents to say in a friendly voice as if they were sitting in your living room, my fellow Americans, and to talk with you rather than to speak at you from a podium. But Roosevelt is a mysterious man. Maybe somewhere in the depths of the character that helped him overcome his polio enough to physically walk into the Oval Office that first time, he found a sense that there might be an extraordinary opportunity that was right in front of him. And sure enough, part of what his legacy is today is to have redefined to some degree, for better, maybe in some ways for worse, the relationship between the public and the president. That turned out to be crucial because what Roosevelt had in mind was not only to solve the immediate problems confronting the country, the crisis of confidence in the banks, for example. It was also to begin to create a narrative for his administration that in some respects endured for decades to come. And that narrative was that, again, maybe for better or worse, depending on where you stand or what your reaction is, the federal government should play a linchpin role in providing security. But Roosevelt defined security in a very distinctive way. It was a concept of security that cut across World War II and the role of America in the world, civil defense, public health, education, social security, risk regulation. In a sense, what he was arguing is that across these domains of economic recovery, social insurance, restoring American engagement in the world, what he wanted was to argue that it was the federal government's role to help manage risks, whether they were abroad or at home. And he used the radio, and as you'll see in a moment, he also used an effort to reorganize the executive branch. There were many contradictions in how Roosevelt went about that, but one contradiction in particular that I would emphasize is his relationship to the law. And what I mean by that is that Roosevelt's administration had plenty of lawyers. Some of them had even gone to Harvard Law School. Maybe they would have acted differently if they'd gone to Stanford. But those lawyers worked very hard to recognize that when the Supreme Court ruled on the constitutionality of a federal agency, that created a problem for the administration, and they had to try to find a way to deal with that. They respected those decisions at some basic level. Those decisions were therefore viewed as headaches, as the Supreme Court handed down decisions that indicated that many Roosevelt initiatives, including the National Industrial Recovery Act, were unconstitutional. But at the very same time, Roosevelt also continually pushed the limits of the law. He pushed the notion of whether the Congress could write a law that was extremely broadly worded to delegate huge amounts of authority to the federal government. When he found that the Supreme Court was blocking him from going forward on particular programs, he'd go back to Congress and insist on getting additional authority. When his court packing plan ran into increasing political troubles, he eventually turned his attention to reorganizing the executive branch and to obtaining authority from Congress to do so. So let me take a closer look at one aspect of Roosevelt's legal strategy to show you again that there are echoes of this today in the 21st century. Roosevelt made a decision as World War II loomed larger and larger that he was no longer going to wait for Congress to authorize the U.S. to help Britain. Roosevelt felt that an ally in need deserved the country's attention, and he moved forward with an effort to trade bases, American bases that could be set up in Europe and in other parts of the British Empire, for destroyers that the British government desperately needed. But there was a problem. The problem was that Congress had not explicitly authorized that. So Roosevelt used a tactic that has increasingly become familiar, which I will describe as aggressive statutory interpretation. His Attorney General, Robert Jackson, an important name because he was later on the Supreme Court, issued an opinion explaining that Roosevelt had an amalgam of executive authority from all the many laws that had been passed by Congress, plus inherent constitutional authority to do these things that were necessary to protect the country's security in a time of need. Now, lest you think that that was the only instance where Roosevelt did this, I want to show you this picture. This is the picture of the North American Aviation Plant in Inglewood, California. This was the site of a terrible labor dispute where labor and management violated an informal agreement that they'd made with the Roosevelt administration, which could be reduced to two phrases: no strikes and no lockouts. Please, we're about to be at war. Don't do this. Nonetheless, labor conflict overtook the plant, and Roosevelt sent in federal troops to deal with the problem and to seize the plant. So some years later, when the steel seizure case was going up to the Supreme Court and involved Harry Truman's effort to seize the steel mill, it's important to note that that action that Harry Truman was engaging in was not entirely unprecedented. And guess what? The plot thickens. Robert Jackson, who was a crucial swing vote in the Supreme Court on that steel seizure case, was at the time the Attorney General. and wrote again an elaborate opinion saying the president has an amalgam of statutory authority to do this, even if we're not going to exactly tell you what the statute actually is. The final point I want to make about Roosevelt has to do with the way he helped reorganize the government. So as he faced this looming conflict of war, he probably realized that some of the domestic achievements that he so cared about were at risk. And in order to try to deal with that, and in order to try to deal with the basic narrative that security really cut across domestic and international contexts, he finally pried loose from Congress a limited degree of authority to reorganize the federal government. He then created what can best be described as a super agency known as the Federal Security Agency that combines civil defense responsibilities, scientific research, education policy, social security, employment placement services, and other labor issues, and on down the line. And that agency, when he created, you can see here the headline, President decrees 3 big offices and centralizing 21, he justified to America and to the world as an effort to make the country stronger for war. So it's an example of how Roosevelt constantly looked for win-win-win situations where he could effectively protect his domestic programs by creating new layers of political appointees that would help the White House manage these agencies, but also that would give him an opportunity to talk again to the nation about how there was a need to prepare for war. Over time, Roosevelt's legacy continued. Here's the headline, Roosevelt passes away. He helped the country weather an economic crisis. Historians argue to this day about how necessary and how critical and how fundamentally important Roosevelt's actions were. But it can't be denied that Roosevelt certainly jolted the country and the Congress and helped restore confidence at a crucial point. It also can't be denied that the federal government looked very different by the time Roosevelt finished his administration. It was much more heavily involved in this notion of helping to manage risk, and that agency that he created, the Federal Security Agency, which you've probably never heard of, lives on today as the Department of Health and Human Services. I also want to note some ways in which Roosevelt's presidency foreshadows the challenges of the 21st century executive branch. There's the issue of crises of governance, of questions about the role of the White House in the governing scheme. There's a question of the president's role relative to the public as changing technologies redefine that relationship. There's the issue of how domestic issues and international issues blur, and this notion of aggressive legal interpretations, particularly for cases that are unlikely to actually be heard in court because there are standing problems, continues to echo today. There's Franklin Roosevelt shaking the hands of a young, ambitious member of Congress from Texas named Lyndon Johnson. About 20 years later, Lyndon Johnson was president of the United States. And in many ways, obviously, Johnson faced very different challenges, very dramatic challenges. Here he is taking the oath of office right after President Kennedy was shot. But in some respects, I would argue that Johnson, like Roosevelt, understood something very basic about the presidency, which is that whatever plans you have, whatever dreams or carefully thought out strategies you have, history has a mind of its own. And if you don't adapt to those historical circumstances, then you can't govern. And what's more, even if you try to adapt, you may not succeed perfectly. The story I want to tell about Lyndon Johnson simply begins by noting 3 things that I would identify with the concept of federalism in some respects. An unresolved question about the role of the federal government in social insurance, particularly with respect to the provision of medical care, which in the Roosevelt administration had been very temporarily, and to Roosevelt's perception, unsatisfactorily resolved as being largely a state responsibility or simply a responsibility that no one delivered, paying for health care for those who couldn't pay for themselves. The question of civil rights, which was the federalism issue par excellence perhaps at the time and understood as such. The question of whether states in the South had a right to treat people who were African American in a way that we do not find acceptable today. And then the question of how the federal government dealt with crime rates that were beginning to rise at a time when historically federal government responsibilities did not really include criminal justice. Roosevelt had faced a divided nation to some degree, but in some respects the nation that Johnson confronted was just as divided, if not even more. The civil rights dramas that I was just alluding to earlier only increased in intensity, were felt in larger and larger chunks of the country as a new disruptive technology, in this case television, began to broadcast these images around the country and then eventually around the world. And those images around the world, by the way, of people getting hit by water cannons in the South were not very helpful when the US was in the middle of the Cold War, trying to argue that its ideals meant something and that its position in the world really was about a set of values that other countries could share. The graph I have over here, and I apologize again that you can't really see the details, but again, I'll just give you the highlights, reflects the incredibly rapid, over the course of about 7 months, loss of approval for the Vietnam War. And we're talking about a drastic loss of approval that coincided with the institution of the draft and with the increase in American troops in South Vietnam, peaking at roughly 500,000 US combat troops. When you look at Johnson and his notes from that time and listen to the conversations that are in some cases recorded from the Oval Office, you have this unmistakable sense that Johnson was too good a politician to avoid the conclusion that he was facing tragedy. And he felt trapped, notwithstanding the incredible ambition that had propelled him from a tiny house in a poor part of Texas all the way up to the presidency, and ultimately all the way up to an extraordinary landslide victory the first time he was elected in his own right. He felt like he was caught because all these different issues, the Civil Rights Act, Medicare and Medicaid, the Omnibus Crime Control and Safe Streets Act, the war in Vietnam, at some level were connected. It was one American public he was dealing with. It was one Congress. And early in the history of the Vietnam War ramp-up, Johnson appears to have concluded, partly out of pragmatism, partly out of principle, that he needed to make sure that America did not walk away from what he viewed as a treaty commitment to South Vietnam. But Johnson was also a good enough politician to understand that South Vietnam was not a functioning government. South Vietnam was intensely corrupt, that the government was intensely unpopular with the people who were there. And so he felt like there were serious questions, and we now know this, about the US's ability to prevail in that conflict. And yet, he also felt like he would not allow on his watch the US to walk back from those commitments. He also felt that if he did, it would be that much harder for him to convince the country to go along with him on what was an extraordinarily ambitious domestic agenda. So as a Democrat, concerned about national security, he proceeded full speed ahead with an agenda to try to reform federalism, including on civil rights and on Medicare and Medicaid and on crime control, but at the very same time to continue and then dramatically ramp up America's commitment in Vietnam. And as you know, one of the things that Johnson found out is that television cuts both ways. Television changed the political landscape in a way that probably made it possible for Johnson to pass the Civil Rights Act together with Congress. Television also made it impossible for Johnson to keep control of the story of the Vietnam War. And before long, Johnson came to the indelible conclusion that he needed to walk away. And he needed to not run for re-election, and he retired to his ranch in Texas, very sad. Some decades later, another Texan from the Lone Star State assumed the presidency. Here he is in Austin, Texas, getting ready to assume the presidency, I believe. And I want to tell you a story about the Bush administration, and I'll end with this, because it's nearer in time, and many among us probably have strong views about what happened in the Bush administration. But there are some interesting features of the Bush administration that perhaps receive less attention, and I think will be helpful to our conversation. So there's a narrative that is not uncommon about the Bush presidency that has many elements of truth. That this was a presidency galvanized by national security issues. In a sense, it was a presidency that engaged the country in 3 wars. A worldwide effort against terrorist activity, a war in Afghanistan and a war in Iraq. That it was a presidency that therefore made a variety of trade-offs to prioritize security, sometimes economic trade-offs, sometimes trade-offs with respect to protections and procedures and privacy. And that it was a presidency that was fundamentally polarizing, that reflected an approach to governing that was not one that was bipartisan. I want to suggest to you that the story is actually a little more complicated in some ways. So let's take a closer look. One of Bush's biggest policy victories is a law known as No Child Left Behind. It has the unwieldy acronym of NCLB. No Child Left Behind was negotiated by the Bush White House with George Miller, a Democrat in the House, and the late Ted Kennedy in the Senate. It was fundamentally and dramatically bipartisan. It passed in the Senate, 91-8, in the House, 384-45. Among other things, it coincided with eventually a $100 billion increase in the role in actually federal education. I want to check that figure because my research assistant came up with it, but I think that there may be a slight nuance with respect to how quickly that increase happened. But the point I want to make here ultimately is that this was a bipartisan compromise that reflected a philosophy that found support among Republicans and Democrats. And the philosophy goes like this. There should be a limited but important role for the federal government in education. That limited role should be to promote flexibility, to promote accountability, to help school districts and states that need the help, to help kids that need the help. But at the end of the day, to support effective teaching and push school districts and states in the direction of accountability, of making sure they understand they need to perform for our kids. And the law reflected a politically popular bipartisan formula that essentially created greater flexibility in resources going to school districts and increased those resources to some degree, or planned to, but then aimed to hold schools accountable with respect to test scores. At the time, it was viewed as a sensible compromise. In a minute, I'll return to note that there are some complexities and difficulties in how this law has been implemented, and today there are a number of critics. But it's important to note that when Bush ran as a compassionate conservative, when he ran on the agenda of bringing people together, it's actually wrong to say that he never did that. He did do that in some cases. There were other cases in which, of course, his choices ended up creating a great deal of controversy. On the security side, President Bush obviously treated the safety, the security of Americans as a huge priority for his administration. But again, here there are nuances. This is the National Institutes of Health, a place where we do a lot of research on chemicals and how they affect American health. The EPA, before 9/11, was concerned about one specific aspect of chemical safety, and that's the concern of what happens if a terrorist blows up a chemical facility. What happens if in densely populated areas of the country like New Jersey, where chemical facilities are not far from large chunks of the population, one of those facilities is blown up by a terrorist. And the result was that the EPA was actually interested in regulating and enforcing safety standards up at these facilities. But shortly after 9/11, the Bush administration decided to go a different tack and said, this is not what we want to do right now, to have the EPA do this. Why don't we wait a little bit until we stand up something called the Department of Homeland Security, and then eventually we'll come back to this. So it took actually a number of years before the Bush administration circled back, and it wasn't until the 2007 Appropriations Act, which went into effect in 2006, that the very first rather general and not very specific standards began to go into effect. And there were a lot of reasons why. The Bush administration had its hands full. Probably there were critics who argued that this was best handled at the state level. There was concern from organized interests that represented different industries. But in the end, what I'm trying to say is that while the Bush administration is perceived as having forged ahead, full speed ahead on everything involving security, the nuances suggest that in fact there were priorities that had to be set and there were decisions that were made even within the context of security. So the more complex picture that I would argue exists is, yes, there were some polarization trends in politics. To some degree, they reflected yet another change in technology, the rise of the internet and the prevalence of cable news. But there were bipartisan domestic political changes. There was a security agenda that was tempered by pluralist politics. And there were pervasive challenges in implementing everything. So I'll briefly give you some highlights of what to take away from these different stories, and then we can open it up for questions. The first thing I want to say is that while we tend to think about the presidency in terms of concrete administrations, many of the challenges I've discussed actually cut across administrations. So the challenge of implementing No Child Left Behind, which has been criticized today as unfortunately not necessarily achieving its goals, as maybe tempting states to water down the standards that they use to test kids. That's a challenge that cuts across administrations. The Vietnam War cut across administrations. The challenge of figuring out how to deal with these aggressive executive branch legal interpretations cuts across administrations. A second point that you can see reflected in all these stories is how much technology changes democracy. And that change is still underway. Here's Barack Obama meeting just a couple of miles from where we are with Mark Zuckerberg, trying to leverage, trying to understand, trying to get ahead of how these social networks are reshaping politics. the third point that I would like you to remember is that there are dynamic forces that affect the relevance of the executive branch. And I would argue we're in the midst of certain trends that are probably increasing the power of the executive branch, even as some of those very same trends raise questions about the power of the nation state itself. But within the nation state, the executive branch may loom larger. So, for example, problems are often understood now to have an international dimension. A domestic food safety problem, when I was working on it, always had a trade dimension. And whenever something has an international or security dimension, it makes the presidency more important. It requires the president to think about how to trade off competing goals. The fact that Congress creates agencies with overlapping mandates, which then requires the White House to deconflict those agencies. The increasing complexity, actual or perceived, of policy issues ranging from genetic engineering to security and defense. Another point is how much the presidency is not about a single he or a she. It's about people who work together, who have the power to make the president's agenda a reality, or perhaps to raise questions about the legitimacy of the president. I have here a picture of Robert Gates, a Republican who was essential to President Obama's efforts to gain legitimacy on national security. If President Obama was going to stick with some of the promises he made in the campaign about, for example, withdrawing from Iraq, it would be essential to have a partnership with somebody that could try to give legitimacy to the administration on national security, who maybe was not from the president's party. Top, I have Jim Comey, the Deputy Attorney General under the Bush administration, and Elliot Richardson, the Attorney General under Nixon. Both of these are examples of individuals who challenged the presidency, who said, if you continue on this particular path, Mr. President, I'm resigning. It's fair to put them together with Gates, because I believe that Secretary Gates could have been in the position to make the same point to the president, to say, yes, you gain legitimacy from having someone like me, a career prosecutor maybe, an independent thinker, a Republican, in your administration, but that means we have to work on this together. And my personal principles are at stake as well. So last, I'll leave you thinking a little bit about how at the end of the day, the presidency is a way, a lens for thinking about society itself, for thinking about the choices that we face and the choices we have to make. It's an institution that reflects to some degree an extraordinary power to help set the agenda of the country. But at the end of the day, in a democracy, the presidency is a reflection of how we, the public, want to make decisions and what we want to prioritize. The fit between what the president and his administration does and what the public wants is never perfect. But I don't think any of the stories that I've shared with you can be understood or explained if you don't think about that link between what is in the president's mind and what is happening at the level of the general public. And with that, I'd like to open it up for your questions. Thank you very much. Who wants to start?
Okay, if democracy depends upon an educated and involved citizen, and in some major parts of this country, that doesn't happen, and education is decreasing rather than increasing, what do you see for the future of elections and public power? It can be dominated, if you will, by some ideological groups.
So the question is about the future of elections in a world where education is not something we can take for granted, and where, in particular in our country, it doesn't always work nearly as well as we expect, hope, or would want.
And the ability, I think it also, the ability of the electorate to become involved, take responsibility, I thought. But then, was it what you said? For me?
And the ability of the electorate to take responsibility for the choices that it makes.
Yeah, but we have a lot of people who don't. In certain areas of the country, people aren't involved, and they don't read. So look at television. There's no really educational programs on television. PBS maybe. And
So let me offer two reflections on that. That's a good and important question. It's very hard to imagine democracy working without people sharing something. Some basic understanding about what it means to debate a policy, about what constitutes truth. But at the very same time, we live in a country where people are extraordinarily diverse in their religious beliefs, for example, in their value systems. So that's always going to be a tension. And it's hard to imagine that that tension doesn't get worse if large chunks of the electorate don't have some basic understanding of what's happening in the world. I will note two things then that complicate that picture. One is maybe a more hopeful and optimistic perspective, the other a question mark that maybe pushes in the other direction. There are some political scientists that have been working to try to understand through experiments and surveys how voters actually make decisions. And this is a long program of research that stretches back decades. But there's a strand of that work that underscores how voters, even if they lack a careful understanding of the issues before them, can use the endorsements of groups around the country as a clue, a proxy, an indication of whom they might want to vote for. And so if you can imagine a voter sitting in West Virginia that is deeply concerned about firearms regulation, that doesn't want the federal government to change the way that it regulates firearms or to make it harder to own guns. This voter may not know all the details of how the Justice Department is applying the Gun Control Act, but knows that if the NRA says this is a good candidate to vote for, that means something to him or her. So that's a more hopeful picture, and that surely is true to some degree. But the other direction is represented by changes in technology and by the reality that as technology has changed, it makes it easier for people to get most of their information from sources that have a particular point of view. If they want that, they can get it. So whereas in the 1960s and 70s, it was much more common for Americans to get a huge proportion of their information from large newscasts that were directed at the entire country, that were being presided over by an individual who sort of viewed it as part of his job to be balanced in the way the information was being transmitted. Now it's possible to find the right webpage on the internet or to tune into the right station that will simply reinforce the views that you already have. And combined with the lack of information, that can be a potentially very troubling trend. Yes? And nobody in this room should deny that democracy is an institution that requires maintenance and that requires support and that requires great effort to keep it functioning and to keep it healthy and vibrant. Sadly, if you look around the world, you see examples of countries that either lose their capacity to function in a democratic way or that lose their capacity to govern themselves effectively, even if they maintain, at least in principle, the democracy. And I would simply observe that there is no easy way of solving the problem of having incredibly complicated, technically sophisticated decisions that are difficult even for a well-informed layperson to follow with the ambition of mass democracy. And that entails, I think, on a great many Americans, really on all of us, some level of responsibility. At one level, to do our part in making our own choices, but at another level, to ask the question of what else might be needed to keep that democracy healthy. And I'll just highlight one thing that I do believe is very crucial to keep a democracy healthy. And that is for people to be willing to say, I'm a Republican, or I'm a Democrat, but I think my party's wrong. And I'm going to say that publicly. And I think that on this particular issue, this is hyperbole, and I don't agree with that particular statement. And I do have a great deal of admiration for politicians from different sides of the aisle who are willing to do that. And I will note that perhaps that's a little less common than it should be than it was in the past, but that it's absolutely crucial for democracy. Because if I could just generalize the point for a moment, that doesn't just matter in an election. It matters when people are having a public discussion of what does the Constitution mean. If you see suddenly a former Republican member of Congress and a former member of the Obama administration saying, we don't agree on a lot of things, but we agree that this is not due process, that sends a message to the country. Back there.
You talked about three very strong men and their executive roles as president. And I was impressed, so I'm going to ask you to address the hypothesis. You showed a lot of graphs that went from 1835 to the present or over many decades. Every one of those graphs had very nice linear increase. And it really brought up the question that the executive branch is irrelevant to the progress of America. We didn't see a large change in the life expectancy during the 30s, a large change in life expectancy during the 60s. All of those graphs continue to increase. That you showed us. And I was very impressed by that. Could you address the hypothesis that the executive branch really is irrelevant to the think it is now?
A few weeks ago, I was having a meeting with a gentleman who works in the private sector. I often find it very useful to get out of academia and out of government and talk to people who are in other parts of the world, so to speak. And I see a lot of that represented in this room, which I appreciate. And the gentleman I was meeting with asked me almost exactly the same question. He used slightly different words. I'll tell you the words that he used. But you'll recognize your question in his words. He said, does the person matter or does history matter? At the end of the day, there are powerful trends that are affecting the world. And you'll notice that I started really by talking about those trends. I started by talking about technology, life expectancy, and so on. So what then is left for a person to do? And what I answered to him and what I'll share with you is essentially a series of imponderables that I think reduce to one basic point, which is history is a powerful river, but the course of that river in small and yet important ways can change and does change. How we navigate that river. Now I'm getting to the point where my metaphors are beginning to run out. But what I mean is, outcomes, this is at least what I felt when I was asking myself that question inside government. And what I felt in the end is that what history does is it attaches a certain probability to certain outcomes. It says there might be an 80% chance that there's going to be a recession, or there might be a 20% chance that this particular piece of legislation is going to pass. And those probabilities can change in material ways at the margin by the choices that are made by these particular folks. So to go back to the graphs, you will notice that yes, indeed, it looks like a linear increase. If I zoom in over 10 or 20 years, you're going to see a more jagged pattern. If I zoom in on the unemployment graph, you see an even more irregular pattern. And of course, it's also true that not all of that variation is driven by individual choices. But in the end, I think the choice really comes down to what I had in the last slide here, which is it's about shaping the national agenda. And when you do that, the only thing we're really changing maybe is the probability that one policy will be enacted over another. That in turn will have a probability of affecting the outcomes of the world. But people do have different worldviews, and I do think they stick sometimes. Good question. Yes, sir.
Staying on the topic of individual choice by the president, you gave some very powerful examples like destroyers and bases. And given that type of aggressive statutory interpretation, what is the reason why a president couldn't close Guantanamo? Was it really the Congress didn't appropriate the money, or was there either actually a statutory reason why, given the membership powers, couldn't take an action like that?
Excellent question. So there are really two questions, if I could disaggregate them. One is, what might drive the kind of choice that a president makes about whether Guantanamo should stay open? Particularly, if I could add some nuance, if this happens to be a president who promised to close Guantanamo in the campaign, and who signed an executive order, essentially on his first full day in office, promising to close Guantanamo. And I would note on that front that a president is surely going to be influenced by the commitments that he makes to the public. And I've certainly seen evidence of this in different presidencies, that presidents care about the commitments that they make. But that could perhaps only be one consideration. Another consideration might be, what exactly does the American public think now about that? And am I facing a situation where 60 or 70% of the American public feel like this is actually the wrong choice now? So how much should I stick to my commitment in the face of now intense and growing public opposition? A second choice, to echo Lyndon Johnson for a moment, is what is the connection between my effort to close Guantanamo and my desire to achieve financial regulatory reform? or healthcare reform, or to reform education in a way that is lasting. And in the end, it's the same members of Congress, and it's one pot of political capital at some level. And the notion of political capital is, of course, a metaphor, but there is a sort of accounting. Where do you push? And in the end, if your decision as president is, I want to push maximally on everything at the same time now, that does entail a certain choice about how effective and relevant you're going to be. I think those are among the hardest, most painful choices, particularly because a question like, should Guantanamo be open? What happens in Guantanamo? Is an important question of pragmatism and national security, but also a question of principle. The second part of your question is, what about the law? And here's where it gets complicated. And I hope one message that you take away from our discussion today is that in presidential power, the Constitution is constantly interacting with statutes that Congress passes. The ultimate decision in the Steele seizure case includes a concurring opinion that is very famous from Justice Jackson. The same Justice Jackson that was Attorney General and was writing the discussions to justify the Lend-Lease, not Lend-Lease, but the Destroyer Bases arrangement, then wrote an incredibly influential framework for thinking about when the president has power. And what's important about that for our conversation today is that Justice Jackson says the president is operating in a different space when Congress has been silent versus when Congress has spoken about something. And there is an analogy between don't ask, don't tell, if you might recall the policy with respect to how to treat lesbian and gay and bisexual service members in the Clinton administration, and the Guantanamo issue under Obama. And the similarity is that in both of those cases, Congress acted. Congress actually passed a law and said, whatever else you might have been thinking you wanted to do, this is what we now want the policy to be. And so the president is now dealing with a different space. And in the Justice Jackson framework, he's outside that framework that involves the president acting when Congress is silent, and it would mean a much higher stakes battle with Congress and a much higher stakes issue of constitutional principle for the president to say, despite the fact that I also ran for president saying that I would honor what Congress says and that I would respect legislation, I feel like I have the degree of inherent power that's strong enough to overcome the very specific legislation that you have issued. Yes, sir.
To what extent do you think that executive power exercised through the agencies can subvert congressional statement of policy?
I think, so the question is, to what extent do I think that...
The president wants to do something, he can do
Exactly.
it through his agencies, even though Congress has said that's not something that Congress wants to do.
It's a great question. Let me give you two answers to that. One is more about descriptively what I see happening in history, and then another, which I'll close with, is just what my own view is about that. So in history, you see presidents constantly finding ways to limit congressional influence. They do this in a variety of ways, by trying to appoint people who are going to be friendly to the administration, by trying to redefine the law, by issuing an interpretation of the law. And while that does have an effect, and sometimes requires Congress to come back and legislate again to be even more specific, there are limits to the president's power to do that. And I do find that there are many situations where the president says, actually, I really can't do this, even if I try to do it in a covert way. The reality is I don't see the law giving me the power to do this. I'll give you a very current example of that, and that was during the debt ceiling controversy. President Obama was urged by some to use constitutional authority that it was believed that he might have under the 14th Amendment to simply raise the debt ceiling, which in a sense is the situation you're describing. It's ordering the Treasury Department, you shall raise the debt ceiling. And the president looked at the cameras and said, I don't think I have that authority. I think I have to work out a deal with Congress. And obviously that made for a very difficult negotiation, because he was going into those negotiations without the ace in the hole that he could pull out to say, well, I'm going to do this on my own if you don't give me the authority. I will say, I think some of the hardest decisions presidents have to make are really legal decisions. Presidents are understood to be managers at some level, to be executives, to be leaders. But in a very real sense, they're also adjudicators. They're also lawyers in chief, because they have to make those judgment calls that you're describing every single week. In a sense, the question is, Mr. President, it's rarely as stark as I think you've described it, although sometimes it is. It's more often something like this. Mr. President, this is what we'd like to do. This is what the law says. There is a way of reading the law that allows us to do this, but there is disagreement in the Justice Department about whether the law should be read that way. So what is your decision? One last question, and then we'll have to wrap up. Yes?
What's your sense of the current administration's, how many people in the current administration would be of the same caliber, say, of Hopkins in Roosevelt's time, or Richardson in Nixon's time?
Part of my message to you today has been how much the presidency depends on the people who are working with and for the president. Sometimes it's the ingenuity of these folks that allows the president to achieve a goal that matters to him and to the nation, but sometimes it's also that these people act as a conscience and tell the president no. And being able to tell the president no, the president says, actually, I really can't do this, even if I try to do it in a covert way. The reality is I don't see the law giving me the power to do this. I'll give you a very current example of that, and that was during the debt ceiling controversy. President Obama was urged by some to use constitutional authority that it was believed that he might have under the 14th Amendment to simply raise the debt ceiling, which in a sense is the situation you're describing. It's ordering the Treasury Department, you shall raise the debt ceiling. And the president looked at the cameras and said, I don't think I have that authority. I think I have to work out a deal with Congress. And obviously that made for a very difficult negotiation because he was going into those negotiations without the ace in the hole that he could pull out to say, well, I'm going to do this on my own if you don't give me the authority. I will say, I think some of the hardest decisions presidents have to make are really legal decisions. Presidents are understood to be managers at some level, to be executives, to be leaders. But in a very real sense, they're also adjudicators. They're also lawyers in chief because they have to make those judgment calls that you're describing every single week. In a sense, the question is, Mr. President, it's rarely as stark as I think you've described it, although sometimes it is. It's more often something like this. Mr. President, this is what we'd like to do. This is what the law says. There is a way of reading the law that allows us to do this, but there is disagreement in the Justice Department about whether the law should be read that way. So what is your decision? One last question, and then we'll have to wrap up. Yes?
What's your sense of the current administration's, how many people in the current administration would be of the same caliber, say, of Hopkins in Roosevelt's time, or Richardson in Nixon's time?
Part of my message to you today has been how much the presidency depends on the people who are working with and for the president. Sometimes it's the ingenuity of these folks that allows the president to achieve a goal that matters to him and to the nation, but sometimes it's also that these people act as a conscience and tell the president no. And being able to tell the president no, I think, is an extraordinary thing. And so let me just finish the thought by noting that, to be perfectly honest, I think I don't have enough distance and perspective from it since I served in the Obama administration and I worked with some of these folks very, very closely. And I feel like I survived battles in the trenches with them. But I think it's fair to say that virtually every presidential administration that I've studied or known is able to attract quite extraordinary people who say the following thing, and that is, I'm going to go serve my country. I think that's what I owe not only my president, but my fellow Americans. And I think the really hard choices come, even in the midst of people being willing to make personal sacrifice, in deciding what it means to serve the country, what it means when you're there to say, I want to make sure that I'm able to be loyal to my president, but also to recognize that I'm in this with a lot of other people, and that my ultimate goal is not just to serve a president or an administration, but to serve the American people. Thank you very much, all of you.
For more, please visit us at stanford.edu.